There is a photograph on Claire Holt's laptop that was never supposed to exist, and the man who took it still checks his door twice before he goes to sleep at night. His name is Marcus Webb. He is 53 years old. He has spent the better part of his adult life doing underwater and drainage work on industrial and private sites, and he is not the kind of person who talks about things he cannot prove. When I sat across from him at his kitchen table, the first thing I noticed was his hands. They were completely still. Not relaxed still, controlled still, the way a person holds themselves when they have spent a long time learning not to show what they are thinking. He told me the job was supposed to be simple: a private reservoir, a faulty inlet valve, a few weeks of controlled drainage and repair work. He told me his crew showed up on a Monday morning in early autumn, the air smelling of wet leaves and cold mud. The kind of morning that feels ordinary in a way that makes you trust it. He told me everything about that first day felt exactly like every other job he had ever taken. Then he picked up his coffee mug, looked at the table for a moment, and said something I have not been able to stop thinking about since. He said, "Whatever is at the bottom of that reservoir, they did not just want it hidden. They wanted it completely gone. And they had the money to make sure that happened." He did not say anything else for almost a full minute. Outside his kitchen window, the sky was flat and gray. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. And I just sat there, because I already knew enough of the story by that point to understand that what he was describing was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, and not something that had been handled carelessly. It had been handled with precision, with planning, with the kind of quiet efficiency that only becomes possible when you have essentially unlimited resources and absolutely no intention of answering to anyone. Marcus took that job because it looked like every other job on paper. He had no reason to dig into who owned the land. Most of his clients were private. That was normal. What was not normal was what his sonar equipment picked up on day 4 of the drain, what his own eyes confirmed when the water was finally gone, and what 2 men in expensive coats told him to forget the moment the discovery became impossible to ignore. He signed nothing. That matters, because if he had signed, you would not be hearing any of this right now. If this story is hitting you the way it hit me, share it and subscribe, because what comes next is the part that changes how you see everything. The family that owned the reservoir did not appear in any public record that was easy to find. That was the first thing Claire Holt told me when she started pulling the thread from her end, and Claire is not someone who gives up on a paper trail easily. She has been a journalist for over 20 years, and she has a specific kind of patience for documents that seem to go nowhere, because in her experience, the documents that seem to go nowhere are usually the ones that are hiding something enormous. The land was held by a private trust. The trust had a registration number, a registered address at a law firm, and no other publicly visible information. No named directors, no annual disclosures, no press mentions going back further than she could search. The law firm that held the registration was old, quiet, and had represented the same family interests across multiple generations. When Claire called them, the person who answered was polite, gave nothing, and the call was flagged by a legal notice to her editor within 48 hours. That is not normal. That is what happens when a family has spent decades building a structure specifically designed to make scrutiny expensive and slow. The estate itself was enormous. The reservoir sat near its center, fed by a network of underground springs that kept it cold even through the warmest months. The land around it had changed hands in pieces over a long span of time, assembled parcel by parcel the way very patient and very deliberate people accumulate things, quietly, without drawing attention, across generations. Nobody in the nearest town knew much about who actually owned the property. They knew there were occasional private crews who came and went. They knew the gates were always locked. They knew that if you drove along the eastern road on a clear day, you could see the water through the trees, flat and dark and still, and that it looked like the kind of place that had always been exactly as it appeared. It had not always been exactly as it appeared, and the family had spent a very long time and a very significant amount of money making sure it looked that way. The sonar screen showed something that should not exist, and the technician running it went quiet in a way that Marcus said he had never seen before in 15 years of working alongside the man. His name was Danny, and Danny was not someone who went quiet. He talked through every job, every scan, every reading, good or bad, routine or strange. But on the morning of day 4, when the water level had dropped enough for the sonar to reach the basin floor cleanly, Danny just stared at his screen and said nothing for almost a full minute. Marcus walked over and looked. What he saw on that screen did not look like a natural lake bed. It did not look like silt and rock and the soft, uneven contours that water carves into earth over time. It looked like a blueprint. Long, straight lines running parallel to each other, perfect right angles at the corners, shapes that repeated in a pattern that was clearly deliberate, clearly designed, clearly the work of something or someone that had known exactly what it was doing. Danny ran the scan again, then again. The shapes did not shift or blur the way instrument noise does. They sharpened. Marcus told me that the feeling in his chest at that moment was not excitement. It was the specific unease you get when something ordinary suddenly reveals that it was never ordinary at all, like lifting a rug and finding a door in the floor underneath. He told the crew to keep draining. He did not call the site office yet. He wanted to see it with his own eyes before he said a single word to anyone. That decision, he told me later, was the one he has thought about most in the years since. Not because it was wrong, but because the moment he made it, something shifted and the job he thought he had taken stopped being that job entirely. It took 3 more days to empty the basin fully. 3 days of watching the waterline drop centimeter by centimeter, of the crew moving around the site with that specific tension that comes when everyone knows something is happening, but nobody is saying it out loud yet. The mud smell was extraordinary. Not the soft organic smell of a healthy lake bed, but something older and heavier, dense and cold, the kind of smell that makes the back of your throat feel thick. Marcus said it reminded him of the smell inside very old buildings, the ones where the air has not moved properly in a long time. When the last pump cycle finished on the morning of the 6th day and the basin floor was finally exposed, the crew stood at the edge and nobody spoke. What was down there was not a foundation. That word is too small for it. A foundation implies something partial, something left over, a few stones that once held up a wall. What was down there was a complex, a complete, deliberate architectural complex that covered the better part of the basin floor. The central structure was enormous, a rectangular shape with clear internal divisions, the outlines of individual rooms still readable through the centuries of silt that had settled into them. Around it, placed at intervals that were too precise to be anything but intentional, were circular platforms, each one roughly the same size, each one positioned to relate to the central structure in a way that suggested a plan, a system, a deliberate geometry. Marcus climbed a scissor lift to photograph the layout from above. He told me that when he looked at the image on his camera screen for the first time, his hand actually trembled, because from above, the outer boundary wall of the complex formed a shape he recognized immediately, a perfect 8-pointed star. He had seen that shape before in books, in old military history photographs, in images of fortifications from a period of history that the official record places in very specific locations on the other side of the world. Not here, not under 20 feet of water on private land with no deed history, no survey record, and no explanation that fit anything he had ever been taught about what this land was supposed to have been. He climbed down from the lift. He looked at his crew. And then he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him, turned around, and saw a man in a dark coat walking toward the site office who had not been there an hour ago. The tunnel did not appear on any engineering drawing Marcus had been given before the job started, and the moment he saw it, he understood that the drawings had been given to him incomplete on purpose. It was his crew member Joel who found it first, on the second morning after the basin was fully drained. Joel was clearing silt from the floor of the central structure when his boot caught on something solid at an angle that the surrounding stone did not explain. He scraped the mud back with his hands and found the edge of a stone frame, precisely cut, set flush with the floor, covering an opening that dropped straight down into darkness. Marcus came over, crouched at the edge, pointed his flashlight in. The air that came up from below was cold and completely still, the kind of cold that has been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. He could see the walls of the tunnel clearly in the beam. They were lined with large flat bricks laid in a diagonal pattern, tight and even, with a pale mortar between them that looked almost white against the dark clay around it. The ceiling was arched. The floor was dry. Not damp, not slightly moist the way underground spaces almost always are, but genuinely dry, which meant the structure had been built with some kind of drainage or sealing system that had survived everything above it. Marcus went down alone first. The ladder they rigged was basic, but it held. At the bottom, he stood in a silence so complete he could hear his own pulse. The tunnel stretched ahead of him in both directions, curving very slightly to the left in a way that suggested it followed a larger geometric plan below the surface. Cut into the walls at regular intervals were small rectangular alcoves, each one about the size of a shoebox, each one empty. Whatever had been stored or mounted in them was gone. He walked forward for what he estimated was over 300 feet before the tunnel split into two branches. He stood at that junction for a moment, flashlight moving between the two passages, and felt something he told me he almost never feels on a job. He felt that he was somewhere he was not supposed to be, not because anyone had told him so, but because the place itself had that quality. The way certain rooms in very old buildings feel occupied even when they are empty. He turned back. When he climbed out of the tunnel and stood again in the cold morning air of the basin, Joel was looking at him with a question on his face. Marcus opened his mouth to answer it, and that was the moment his radio crackled, and the site foreman's voice came through flat and tight, telling him to come up to the surface immediately, not to finish what he was doing. Not when he had a moment, immediately. Marcus climbed out of the basin and walked to the site office, and the man in the dark coat he had seen earlier that morning was now sitting inside it with a second man Marcus had never seen before. The foreman was standing near the window with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor, which told Marcus everything he needed to know about the dynamic in that room before a single word was spoken. The two men were calm. That was the thing Marcus kept coming back to when he described them to me. Not aggressive, not visibly threatening, just completely, deliberately calm, the way people are calm when they have had this conversation many times before and know exactly how it ends. They said they represented the trust. They said the documentation phase of the project was now complete. They said all photographs, all scan data, all written notes taken on site were to be collected and handed over before the end of the working day. They said this in the same tone you might use to explain a change in a lunch order. Marcus looked at the foreman. The foreman did not look back. Then one of the men said something that Marcus has repeated to me word for word every time we have talked about it. He said, "You have found something that was meant to stay where it was. The best thing you can do right now is treat this the same way." Marcus asked what exactly they had found. The man looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a warning, but somewhere between the two. He said, "Something old, something that creates problems when people start asking questions about it." Marcus nodded. He said nothing. He walked back out of the site office into the cold air and stood for a moment looking out across the exposed basin floor at the star-shaped complex sitting silently in the mud below him. Then he took his phone out of his pocket. He had one photograph on it, taken from the scissor lift before the men arrived, showing the full layout of the complex from above, the 8-pointed outer wall unmistakable against the dark silt. He opened his messages. He found Claire Holt's number. He typed 3 words. He pressed send. The 3 words were, "I found something." What happened next is the part of this story that the men in that office had not planned for. By the next morning, 2 members of Marcus's crew had already signed and were gone, and he had not even known the meetings were happening. That was the thing that hit him hardest, not the pressure, not the legal language, not the money being offered, but the speed of it. The trust had moved overnight. While Marcus was sitting in his rented room in town, going over everything in his head, the men in dark coats had already begun working through the crew list one name at a time. Quietly, methodically, the way you clear a table before setting it for a different meal. By the time Marcus arrived on site the following morning, the atmosphere had changed completely. People were not making eye contact. Conversations stopped when he walked past. Danny, the sonar technician who had gone silent at his screen 4 days earlier when the shapes first appeared, gave Marcus a look across the yard that lasted about 1 second before he turned and walked toward the site office. Marcus understood what that look meant. Danny had already had his meeting. The 2 men from the trust worked through the crew over the course of 2 days. Marcus watched it happen from a distance, piece by piece. Each meeting took place in the site office with the door closed. Each one lasted between 20 and 40 minutes. When the crew member came out, something was different about them. Not broken, not frightened exactly, just settled in a way they had not been before, the way people look when a decision they were struggling with has been made for them, and they have accepted that. The agreement being offered was straightforward. A payment equivalent to several months of wages, deposited within 72 hours, in exchange for a signed document that covered everything seen or heard on the property during the duration of the project. The document was thorough. Claire later described it to me as one of the most comprehensive confidentiality agreements she had ever read, drafted by people who had clearly done this before, and who had thought carefully about every possible way the information could leak. Most of the crew signed. Marcus counted 7 who he was fairly certain had not, including himself and Joel. By the end of the second day, 3 of those 7 were gone from the site, removed quietly, their equipment packed and waiting for them at the gate. Joel was one of them. Marcus watched him walk out without looking back, and felt something go cold and specific in his chest, the recognition that the circle of people who knew what was under that basin was shrinking in a very deliberate and very organized way. He had not signed. Nobody had asked him to yet. And he understood, in the way you understand things that nobody says out loud, that his meeting was being saved for last. The demolition crew arrived on a Wednesday morning, and Marcus had never seen any of them before in his life. That was the detail that stayed with him more than anything else about those final weeks on the property. His crew built things, fixed things, understood the logic of how structures worked and why. These men were different. They moved through the basin with the specific efficiency of people who had been given a very clear objective and no other instructions. The first thing they brought down into the basin was a set of pneumatic breakers, the kind used for serious concrete and stonework, heavy industrial equipment that you do not hire for a minor demolition job. Marcus stood at the edge of the basin that first morning and watched them position the equipment against the outer wall of the complex, the same wall that from above formed the 8-pointed star he had photographed. The sound when the first breaker started up was enormous, a hard, rhythmic crashing that echoed off the basin walls and sent birds scattering from every tree within a quarter mile. He stood there and watched them destroy it. He told me that watching it happen was the strangest kind of helpless he has ever felt. Not like watching an accident, which is sudden and random. Like watching something being erased one careful line at a time by someone who knows exactly what they are doing and has decided that the erasing matters more than whatever was there before. The carved stonework went first, broken into pieces too small to be recognizable. Then the internal walls of the central structure, reduced to rubble and hauled out in carts. The tunnel entrance that Joel had uncovered was filled with poured concrete, a truck reversing to the edge of the basin and pumping the mix down through a chute until the opening was completely sealed. The circular platforms around the central structure were dismantled stone by stone, each piece removed separately. The basin floor was then graded flat with machinery Marcus had never seen used on a site this size, heavy and precise, smoothing the surface until the geometry of what had been there was completely gone. Then a layer of compacted clay went down across the entire floor, thick and even, a seal between what had existed and whatever would sit above it from now on. It took just over 5 weeks. When it was finished, Marcus stood at the edge of the empty basin for the last time and looked down at a flat gray surface that told you nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then the inlet valve was opened and the water began to come back in. What Marcus found when he started looking into the 8-pointed star did not make him feel better. It made him feel like he had pulled a single thread and watched an entire wall begin to come apart. He started simply, the way anyone would, searching for examples of that specific geometric form in architectural history, in military history, in the records of fortifications built across the world over the last several centuries. What came back was not a small or tidy answer. The 8-pointed star layout appeared in documented ruins on at least 4 continents, in locations that had no obvious connection to each other and no shared history that the official record acknowledged. Marcus is not an academic. He will tell you that himself. He is a man who knows how water moves through stone and how drainage systems fail over time, and that specific knowledge is actually part of what made what he was reading so hard to dismiss. Because the engineering descriptions he was finding, the drainage systems, the sealed tunnel floors, the arched brick ceilings, they matched what he had walked through in the basin with a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like a signature. Someone had built all of these things. The same someone, or the same tradition, working across distances that the accepted story of human history cannot easily explain. He found references to a name that kept appearing in the older research, not in mainstream sources, but in the margins of them, in footnotes and in letters between researchers who seemed to be piecing something together slowly and carefully from opposite ends. The name was Tartaria, not a country in the modern sense, not a civilization with a flag and a capital city, but something older and harder to define, a presence on maps that existed for centuries and then was removed, a builder culture whose traces kept surfacing in places where it had no business being according to everything we think we know. Marcus sent Claire everything he found. She spent 3 weeks cross-referencing it against the property records she had already been pulling, and what she found was a pattern that neither of them had expected. The land above the reservoir had changed hands 4 times in the last 100 years. Each transfer had been handled by the same law firm. Each transfer had been preceded by a drainage or inspection project on the reservoir itself, conducted by private crews, documented nowhere publicly, and followed within weeks by a return to normal operations. This had happened before. Not once before. 3 times before. Whatever was under that water, someone had been checking on it and containing it across multiple generations. Marcus Webb does not drive past the property anymore. He told me that the last time he went out that way, just once, about a year after the job ended, he parked along the eastern road the way Claire had described doing in her own reporting and sat looking at the reservoir through the tree line for a long time. The water was exactly as it had always appeared, still, dark, cold-looking even from a distance, fringed by old trees whose roots had been drinking from those underground springs for longer than any deed recorded. Nothing on the surface told you anything. That is the thing about a perfect cover. It does not look like a cover. It just looks like the world. The photograph Marcus sent Claire that morning in the site office is still on her laptop. She has printed it twice, kept copies in 2 separate locations, and sent a copy to one other person whose name she has not told Marcus and that Marcus has not asked for. It shows the basin from above, The complex sitting in the dark silt, the outer wall forming its eight-pointed shape with a clarity that no amount of explaining away can dissolve. It is not proof of everything. Marcus will tell you that directly. He is careful about what he claims and what he does not. But it is proof that something was there, something precise and deliberate and very old, and that someone with significant resources made a considered decision to destroy it rather than let it be examined. That decision is the part Marcus cannot let go of. Not the discovery itself, as extraordinary as it was, but the response to it. Because the discovery tells you that the past is more complicated than we were taught. But the response tells you something about the present, about who holds the version of history that gets to be official, about what they are willing to do to keep it that way, and about how long that has been happening without most of us ever noticing. There is a version of events where Marcus signs the agreement, takes the money, and goes home. In that version, this story does not exist. The photograph gets deleted. Claire never gets the message. The reservoir fills up and the surface closes and the world moves on exactly as it was designed to. But Marcus did not sign. And that single decision, made in about 30 seconds while standing in cold air with his phone in his hand, is the only reason you are hearing any of this right now. Think about that for a moment. Think about how many times that choice has gone the other way. How many sites like this one have been drained and destroyed and refilled without a single person on the crew deciding to hold something back? How many photographs were never taken? How many messages were never sent? The water covers everything eventually. That is what it is designed to do. But sometimes, just sometimes, something gets out before the surface closes. And here is the question I want you to sit with and answer honestly in the comments below. If you had been standing in Marcus's position with a signed agreement on one side and the truth on the other, and a very powerful family waiting to see which one you chose, what would you have done? I think most people believe they know the answer. I am not sure most people are right. If this story made you think, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Every person who does makes it harder to keep these stories buried.